Foucault has faced a common critique in many of his works that his conception of power has focused too strongly on the methods and technologies, thereby reducing the human subject of power to a passive agent, unable to form effective resistances. In The Subject of Power, Foucault attempts to reframe and clarify his academic goals and his definition of the subject to state instead that his objective, and I quote, has been to create a history of the different modes by which, in our culture, human beings are made subjects, allowing for a more nuanced conception of how subjectivity and subjection occurs in a power structure. In this presentation, I want to focus on how Foucault relates subjectivity to resistance, and his justification for how and why resistances occur. I will argue that Foucault's definition of the subject is insufficient, as it still remains quite fixed in the narrative of passivity. Foucault defines the subject by its double meaning. He writes that subject can mean, quote, subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by conscience or self-knowledge, unquote. In this way, Foucault argues that power is not simply oppressive, but productive in creating the individual identity. The state, he argues, both unifies and individualizes in order to create categories of identities through which to exert power. Power manufactures individuals and identities in categories that the human being, him or herself, makes themselves subject to. Here, Foucault brings up the example of sexuality and the self-identification that occurs within this discourse. With this type of prescribed self-individualization in mind, Foucault brings up the topic of resistance. Any kind of resistance, according to him, takes issue not with the group or institution and its power as such, but of this aforementioned mode of power exertion used by the institution that urges subjects to classify themselves into their individualizing categories. This is called subjection. Foucault states that resistances are inherent to the nature of productive power and even its effect, as it creates individual identities upon which to exert itself. Subjects that become resistant to the stereotypes and reductions of their self-assigned identities are asking the question, who are we, outside of economic and ideological abstractions? This idea of an identity imbued upon the subject that he takes upon himself afterwards leaves room for interesting ideas about the nature of subject autonomy within the resistance. Amy Allen, a feminist theorist, argues that this idea leaves room for the notion that, quote, subjection involves being subjected to power relations, but this process produces subjects who are capable of action and even autonomy, unquote. Here, Allen makes clear that just because a subject is individualized through a power structure, it doesn't mean that they are stripped of an ability to find autonomy outside of it because they are self-aware enough to question their reality and identity. I would disagree. Here, Foucault argues quite explicitly that the subject's resistances are brought about specifically and exclusively within the context of disciplinary institutions and norms. All identities, and thus forms of resistance, will be derivative of the system of power if the subject is individualized within its context. Even the question, who are we, can only be answered with the institution or power relation in mind, since that is the subject's only frame of reference. Zizek argues, for example, that if a subject is attached to identity categories created by norms of a power relation, autonomy from such a power relation becomes chimeric, and these forms of resistances that Foucault describes become harder to explain. I think Foucault would agree that subjects are not autonomous, even in their resistances, because resistances are inherent to the nature of productive power, and so this action is simply an effect of a power relation at work. So Foucault's conception of a subject remains imbued with a sense of passivity to the power relation and its strategies. Foucault instead suggests that resistant subjects must think of new forms of subjectivity that move away from the kind of prescriptive individualization that the state or power institution imbues upon the subject. Foucault asks the subject to not question who they are in their resistance, but who they can be in order to escape this subjection. Foucault does not lead us any more than this, though, to this new subjectivity. perhaps because it cannot exist within his conception of power relations and subjectivity as they stand. If a subject cannot be autonomous within his framework, as Zizek argues, how can a new subjectivity be conceived? This is an interesting question to keep in mind as you read Blue Ticket. Can Calla really escape her prescribed identity? Does she find a new subjectivity in trying to do so? And if so, how? Thank you.